for coming. Today's symposium. This is a talk. This is the type of talk that normally would take place in Washington, in the Beltway. A talk about a specific U.S. policy. We have brought this. This sort of collaboration between CIPER and WOLA specifically has the purpose of trying to bring this kind of talk outside of Washington, not just to kind of bring it outside, but for a specific purpose. And that is because these talks on Venezuela have become very polarized and very sort of uninteresting, oftentimes in the context of Washington. And that's for the following reasons. The current U.S. government. Let me just start with Venezuela. The issue of Venezuela, and Venezuela's government over the past 20 years has been, of course, very polarizing, as you all know. It's polarized the academy, polarized public policy discussion, divided opinion for the past 20 years. The current U.S. government of Donald Trump is itself equally polarizing, as we all know. It's polarized U.S. public opinion and a good part of the media as well. This is sort of a toxic combination for trying to understand something like U.S. policy towards Venezuela. From the right, you see analyses that suggest that sanctions have had no effect on the population and that the entire economic meltdown occurring in Venezuela is the fault of Maduro government's destructive policies. Usually these arguments rest on arguments such as the idea that the economic crisis began before sanctions, which of course is true, but it's just a fallacious argument to think that the original cause is the only cause. You can have other causes that come into a phenomenon and can make it worse or can continue it. Others argue that the Maduro government basically robbed all the oil profits previously, and so these oil sanctions have no impact on the population. Of course, if that was true, if they had robbed all the oil profits in an economy in which 90% of the foreign currency is earned through oil exports, everyone would have been dead a long time ago. It's completely false. This one, of course, is especially popular, I think, on Twitter. From the left, of course, there are analyses that suggest that everything that has happened, the whole humanitarian emergency that Venezuela is experiencing, is because of these sanctions. I think this policy, as many of us suggested, these economic sanctions, are providing the perfect red herring for those who want to provide some sort of way to exculpate the Maduro government. So I think this debate is indicative of a larger phenomenon, and that is a dilemma in North-South relations. I think we still live in a world in which most economic and political power is in the global North, as well as intellectual, as well as the power to create analyses and critiques. Most of that resides in the global North, in the information apparatus. But one source of current inequality then is that knowledge created in the global North can oftentimes treat realities in the global South with broad brushstrokes, can treat them with a very superficial analyses and enable instrumentalization. Enable instrumentalization of these contexts for the interests of people in the global North. So those who want to support Donald Trump or support neoliberal policy more broadly will deny obvious realities. Okay, I gotta speak a little louder. Where's the microphone? Up here. Okay. Those who want to fight Donald Trump or global imperialism do the same, trying to further the struggle by coming up with analyses that blame U.S. imperialism for everything that happens in Venezuela and exculpate Maduro. Both of these, I think, can be considered a modern-day form of colonialism, whereby people in the global North use their position of privilege to instrumentalize the realities of the global South for their own purposes, however noble those purposes may be, or however much you might agree with them. Today, what we're trying to do is counteract this tendency with a discussion that gets at the actual specifics. And we have three leading experts on the current Venezuelan sanctions regime and its impact. Jeff Ramsey is the director for Venezuela at the Washington office in Latin America, where I also am a senior fellow. He has an MA in International Relations from American University and previously worked for Inside Crime. Earlier this month, he was in Geneva, invited by the Social Science Research Council to a meeting with the United States, or with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, to give her a briefing. Francisco Monaldi is a frequent visitor here at Tulane. He is a fellow in Latin American energy policy at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. He has affiliations all over the place, too many to name, but they include Columbia University as well as the Tecnológico de Monterrey in Mexico. He's also the founding director and professor at the Center for Energy and Environment at IESA in Venezuela, which is sort of a graduate school of administration there. Francisco Rodriguez is an economist and the director for Oil for Venezuela Foundation. He started his career at the Venezuelan Congressional Budget Office. He was faculty also at Wesleyan College and for many years the lead economist in the Americas division of the Bank of America. We're very fortunate to have him this year as the Greenleaf Visiting Professor in the Stone Center. Okay, so with that, let me just turn it over to Jeff, who will get us started.
Sure. Well, first I just want to thank the organizers. This is a great event. I'm looking forward to a really interesting discussion. I'm Jeff Ramsey. I'm the director for Venezuela at WOLA, the Washington Office on Latin America. We're a research and advocacy organization based in DC. We work very closely with partners in Venezuela to defend human rights in the country and advance a peaceful return to democracy. In the last 5 years, sanctions have become the primary tool of U.S. foreign policy towards Venezuela. And so, as a result, we've had to study them quite closely, and we work with counterparts in Congress, in the State Department, and the administration to point out the ways in which sanctions are having an impact on the various nuances of the Venezuelan crisis today.
It's right there.
I do, yes. Yeah, so before I get into that, I want to talk about the roots of the crisis in Venezuela very briefly, and the sort of various kinds of sanctions that the Trump administration and the Obama administration before it have implemented on Venezuela, as well as go into a little bit kind of the dominant narrative in Washington regarding sanctions on Venezuela. So let's see if I can get this to work. Maybe I can just get a stand up.
No, it's fine. It should work.
A little bit of technical difficulties. So yeah, I mean, if you
custom the keyboard.
That should work. Can that extend a little here?
The arrows should work on that.
No. Okay. If you just hand me the mouse. Okay, so you can kind of think about the crisis in Venezuela today as the result of an authoritarian government that emerged from the executive authority that's remained in power through repression and rigged elections, rather than sharing power with an opposition-controlled legislature. The shift from individual sanctions to sectoral sanctions in Venezuela kind of maps out somewhat well with 3 elections in Venezuela. The legislative elections that occurred in December 2015, the opposition won a 2/3 majority with that, and then in January of the next year, the Chavista-controlled Supreme Court moved almost immediately to neutralize the opposition majority, denounced fraud in certain states, and essentially declared that the legislature would be in default. Then we saw the Constituent Assembly in July 2017, which was convened without a popular referendum. Unlike the 1999 Constituent Assembly, there's clearly documented irregularities in that election. And we've seen since then that we haven't seen the emergence of any kind of draft of the Constitution, and instead it served as kind of a rubber stamping authority for the executive branch to get around. Again, this opposition-controlled legislature. And then most recently we saw the electoral event in May 2018, which was convened by this Constituent Assembly, violating standard electoral timelines. There was a partial opposition boycott. There was the candidate who did participate in the elections, Henry van Koon, also documented irregularities and saw this electoral accord that was signed with the Maduro government violated in the process. And then Maduro assumed a mandate on January 10th next year based on this election. And in response to that, we saw the oil sanctions that have been in place since January 2019. So I think this is a range problem. Why don't I just go and stand by?
I just put new batteries in here.
Okay.
I'm gonna give that one more go.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Well, as I mentioned, there's with each of these steps, we've seen the response from the U.S. government deepen. From 2008 to 2015, we saw a strategy that relied mostly on individual sanctions, so freezing the assets of individuals in Venezuela, denying them U.S. visas. And then after the Constituent Assembly was convened, we saw the U.S. adopt the first sectoral sanction through financial sanctions, and then we saw oil sanctions, which, as I mentioned, were adopted after Maduro claimed a mandate based on elections in 2018. The individual sanctions have been applied to 130 people who have been named and had their assets frozen by both the United States as well as important U.S. allies like the EU, Switzerland, and Panama. The strategy around individual sanctions has been mostly built on promoting cracks in the government.
Is this the one you want?
That does. That's great. Thank you.
These arrows.
Okay. It doesn't seem to be working for me. Okay, great. So we've seen that the logic around this is that if you have your assets frozen, you lose your ability to go shopping in Miami or even in some cases have a bank account, which, as it turns out, is a big problem for political and economic elites. I mean, we've interviewed individuals who have been sanctioned by the United States that complain that, well, the first thing they'll say is that, sanctions have no impact. This is an affront to our national sovereignty. But then they'll say that, my wife who lives in Miami is constantly being approached by State Department and Treasury. My daughter no longer talks to me. It's created all kinds of difficulties for me financially. So there does seem to be some significant impact on individuals. There's been a suggestion that the failed uprising on April 30th of last year was primarily triggered because of individual sanctions, and the best argument for that is the fact that the defected head of the intelligence agency, Sabine, was taken off of the list after participating in that.
What are the SDNTK, SDG?
Yeah, so here, if you look at this, this is the overlap among various individuals that have been sanctioned by all of the sanctioning countries. The US just recently added those 4 dots that are in the EU and not in the US, so we have to update that. But if you look at the green and red dots, these are sort of, when you're added to the Treasury list, you you're at it according to an executive order. And some people that have been sanctioned for narcotics or links to the drug trade are the red dots. And the U.S. in its communications has been very clear that these individuals are not subject to sanctions relief. There's no way that these people can get relief from sanctions. But the green dots have, if you look at the communications from State Department and Treasury, they are all told that they can have access to sanctions relief if they take significant actions in defense of human rights, denouncing corruption, or restoring democracy in Venezuela. And it's interesting to look at the breakdown of those. They include people like Maduro's inner circle. I mean, technically, Delcy Rodriguez, Jorge Rodriguez, Maduro himself all have access to individual sanctions relief if they take certain steps. And that's not a fact that's often communicated. Then we see the financial sanctions that were issued in August 2017. As I said, they prevent access to the U.S. financial system. There are important exceptions to these financial sanctions. They don't apply to new debt that is authorized by the National Assembly, which is technically its constitutional role. They also don't apply to transactions related to the import of food and medicine or humanitarian assistance. But in spite of those exceptions, we are seeing overcompliance. Banks and other financial institutions are notoriously risk-averse, and over time, they have closed accounts, denied transactions. We work with many human rights organizations in Venezuela that have had banking problems since the imposition of the financial sanctions in 2017. Then finally, we've seen the oil sanctions. We've been pretty critical of these at WOLA because they've had an undeniable impact on oil production. Oil sales account for about 90% of the hard currency that's used to pay for imports in the country. As David said, it's never been close to the case that the government steals all of the proceeds from oil. Otherwise, everybody probably would have been dead long ago. This in turn has had an impact on imports. So this is oil production. You can see the financial sanctions of the first line, the second line of the imposition of oil sanctions, and then the third line is this imposition of secondary sanctions in August of this year. And you can see there's a clear impact on oil production and on imports as a result. Having said that, it's important to stress that this crisis began long before the imposition of sanctions. There's been some estimates that Venezuela lost around 45% of its economy before the imposition of any financial sanctions in 2017. So whenever you look at the impact of the sanctions, it's important to put them in context. So there are advocates of sanctions often claim that they are hurting the regime more than the people. They point to things like the fact that when significant negotiations were occurring last year, brokered by the Norwegian government, one of the clearest asks of Maduro was for sanctions relief. And it seems that the sanctions were a strong motive for their participation in negotiations. People also point to the fact that currency reserves are dwindling, although we've also seen that things like illicit mining and other kinds of illicit activities have provided alternative sources of revenue to Maduro's key stakeholders in the inner circle. There is this assumption that the sanctions have impacted some of this illicit activity, but it's been very difficult to verify that. We know that from the literature, sanctions have a success rate of between 10% and 34%, and if the goal of sanctions is specifically regime change, the odds of success are even lower. People often make the argument that, okay, fine, sanctions are in fact having a broader impact on the population, even though they're not the cause of the original cause of the crisis. Like, we're willing to accept that they've had secondary impacts. But just like a sick patient, sometimes medicine needs to cause some harm in the name of the greater good. But I think, you know, if you run with that metaphor and you say, okay, we're going to apply a treatment to you that has a success rate of between 10% and 34%, meaning it's going to fail between 70 and 90% of the time. And oh, by the way, there's going to be significant impacts of this treatment that's going to make the symptoms of your disease worse. I mean, none of us would really opt for that treatment. So I think it's an important metaphor to actually consider. In the meantime, you know, we've seen the debate on sanctions in Washington kind of become increasingly rigid. The debate on sanctions in Washington is maximalist. The U.S. government has been very clear that there is no path to oil sanctions relief until Maduro leaves power, and the state oil company PDVSA is transferred to either Juan Guaido as interim president or a subsequent democratically elected government, meaning there's no sanctions relief until after elections occur. And then also, I think there's another feature of the way that sanctions are debated in Washington, which kind of presumes that any leverage that they trigger is absolute. So there's this idea that if you talk about any kind of sanctions relief, you lose all of your leverage. You know, you can't talk about suspension of sanctions relief or lifting of sanctions or restarting, you know, things that led to the success of the Iran deal, for instance. You know, there's just this idea that once we lift sanctions, there's no going back. We can't reimpose them, which is a fallacy, and it's, for some reason that's often the way things are discussed. I will leave that there. I turn it over.
Thank you. Next, Francis Morales.
Yes. So I will focus my presentation on the oil sector.
Just upload your
Sure.
presentation, right?
I will focus on what has happened in the oil sector before and after the sanctions to illuminate a little bit not only this issue about how to assign responsibility for sanctions compared to previous development, but also to understand what could be done to sanctions and what could be the long-term impact of sanctions. One thing that I want you to keep in mind is that the oil sector in Venezuela, by its nature, it's a sector in which when you reduce production, you typically reduce production capacity, not only production, and you eventually lose you need to really invest to recover back production. So this is not a country like the Middle Eastern countries in which you could close production and open it back without significant investments. So any effect that you have on the oil industry today will have implications for recovery in the future, much more than in other cases. So, but I will only go very quickly here. The oil sector was already, particularly if we consider the specific oil sanctions, was already in very bad shape. Production was about 1.3 million barrels when Chavez came into power, was around 3.4 million barrels. But more importantly, the production operated by the national oil company PDVSA was just about 600,000 barrels. And this is a company that when Chavez came into power was producing by itself 3.1 million barrels of oil. So the collapse was absolutely spectacular of the national oil company. It was only compensated in part by a very significant production in joint ventures that at its peak was about 1.15 million barrels of oil, and by the day the sanctions were imposed was around 700,000 barrels. And also production moved from conventional oil to more extra heavy oil in the Orinoco belt, which is generally less profitable and requires either upgraded to be sort of creating special refineries to upgrade the oil, or blended with lighter oil that has to be either the lighter conventional oil from Venezuela that used to be the one sold at the best premium, that now you have to blend it, and sort of it's in that sense it's not ideal, but otherwise you have to import, and that's what Venezuela has been doing recently. I don't think there is. I think there is no doubt, at least from the perspective of if you analyze specific projects, and as I said, joint ventures that were producing about more than half of the production when the sanctions were established, that the financial sanctions were already affecting these companies. But without a doubt, the biggest blow has been the current oil sanctions. One example of the decline of the Venezuelan oil industry is also the refining sector, which even before sanctions was producing at 20% of capacity. So what were the roots of the pre-sanctions collapse? Basically, where everyone probably has heard that Chavez fired about half of the employees, but represented about 80% of the top management, the engineers, and the people with expertise about technical expertise. The company was significantly politicized and became a sort of a social ministry, development ministry, in charge of all sorts of program, like, for example, building housing. Contracts that had added that million barrels that I mentioned were forcefully renegotiated. Some projects were nationalized, and two of the largest players in the country, Conoco and Exxon, left and went into arbitration against Venezuela. Then the government also expropriated domestic service companies and a few foreign service companies. That also was a big blow to some specific areas in which these companies played a significant role. Then the other thing is that not only through the use of the national company as a ministry, but also through other means like windfall tax, the overvaluation of the exchange rate, and I forgot to mention there the Chinese funds. Basically, the government has over-extracted resources from the national oil company to a point in which the company had to increase its debt from $3 billion to $45 billion without significantly increasing investment. So this was, the proverbial killing of the goose that laid the golden eggs in many, many ways. One striking fact is that Hugo Chavez realized that he needed an increase in investment in the oil sector, and so he signed a lot of deals, some with national companies from China, Russia, etc., but also with Chevron got a very important project, Repsol got another one, Eni from Italy another one, and of all those projects signed between 2010 and until recently, basically none has been executed, and they produce about less than 10% at its peak of what they were supposed to produce. There is only one project in Venezuela that has been executed, that is an offshore natural gas project that was executed totally by Repsol and Eni. Then, of course, not only there's the significant increase in debt of the company, but the oil exports started to be committed to repay loans from China and Russia that were, most of them, not debt of PDVSA, but of the government, but nevertheless, if they were paid with oil, they ended up being, paid by PDVSA. Of course, massive energy subsidies in the domestic market. One thing that we, when we calculate the amount of windfall that the government received, we often forget that a lot of that windfall disappeared even before it, got to the government by basically giving away at its peak 800,000 barrels for almost zero, which of course is a terrible way to use resources. Eventually, service companies started not getting paid in Venezuela. Many of the service companies, both PDVSA and the JVs relied a lot, left the country or dramatically reduced its activity. Basically, I mean, this is before even the sanctions of 2017. Most of the largest service companies were not providing services to PDVSA, just only to the JVs that had a partner that took charge of the payments. And of course, in that scenario, imagine what happens when you have a price collapse and you had all those things in place. And here you can see, oops, it's moving so fast. Explain tricks with me.
It doesn't like this slide.
Yeah. Okay, so this is sort of the big picture of the Venezuelan oil sector declining massively in the 1970s because of lack of investment in the 1960s, and the fact that concessions were not renewed. Then you have the OPEC cuts in the early 80s. Then you have the OPEC basically decides not to have any more quotas, and Venezuela opens up the oil sector and adds about 1.1 million barrels of production. Also, PDVSA production increases significantly. And then you have some OPEC cuts at the beginning of the 2000s. Then you have the oil strike, some recovery, and then the decline. And we'll see how that relates to the. You can see there, as Jeff showed, the financial sanctions, and then the oil sanctions. By the way, it's very important also to mention the blackouts that at the first semester of 2019 were a really important part. One thing that I wanted to stress is that the counterfactual in Venezuela shouldn't be, that, production didn't fall that fast, before 2016. The counterfactual is what should have happened during the oil boom should have been a very significant increase in oil production. Not only because there were already projects and investments, profitable investments, that were supposed to have initiated and would have had about between 1 and 2 million barrels of production for Venezuela, but because everyone else did it, everyone else except for Venezuela. So the gap, the counterfactual should not be, stable production, but a very significant increase in production, at least until 2014. After 2014, of course, most NOC's production declined because of the declining oil prices. Here we have also an idea about how important was the loss of the U.S. market. Already we had a very significant decline before sanctions. The U.S. market represented only about 500,000 barrels by the end of 2018. But it had, at some point been a very big deal. And you can see that a lot of it was because of the increase in production in during the period of the apertura. And this is what happened, of course, with the, now it is zero. Venezuela was exporting, when this happened, around 1.2 million barrels, so 500,000. If you think about it, it's almost. I mean, production is slightly lower than the loss of the total. Here you can see that the change. The orange was the U.S., and now you can see how basically the oil is going to China and India, and a little bit is going to Europe and other places. In terms of the activity itself in the industry, a good indicator is the rig count. You can see when production was going up in Venezuela, we had more than 100 rigs in operation. During the middle, you can see sort of a relatively stable level of, between 60 and 70 rigs in operation. One of the problems of using that sort of as a measure of the activity is that the productivity per rig declined almost to a third of what it was. And but anyways, there was never the investment necessary to keep production. Remember that in Venezuela is one of the countries with the highest natural declination rate of oil fields, about 20%. If you don't drill in Venezuela, you get 20% decline of production every year. So you need very significant investment just to keep production stable. And of course, that didn't happen. So what has been the specific effect of sanctions? First, of course, the loss of the U.S. market, the loss of the U.S. as a diluent supplier that was very significant. Thank you. The much higher transportation cost with the oil now has to be sent to Asia. The discount, this is not covered enough in the media and in the analysis that we make. The last figure I heard from December of last year is that Venezuelan barrels are being sold for $30 less not than the WTI, but that the equivalent basket, this is reported by Platts, for example. So $30 less is like half or less than half. So the effect in price seems to me that it's almost as bad as the effect in production or worse. During a part of the year, particularly when they threatened secondary sanctions in August, there was a significant accumulation of inventories that meant that the restriction, sort of the binding constraint, was not any more production, but it was the capacity to sell oil. They were basically producing oil and accumulating and had like 60 million barrels of inventory. But we did see that at the end of the year, they were able to export more than they produce. And this is sort of the round figures that I have now. They are exporting about 1 million barrels and they are producing between 700,000 and 800,000 barrels. And they can do that because they had this massive inventory. So as I said, production sort of stabilized or slightly increased. I think partly because for a while production capacity was higher than production, meaning that they were shutting off some wells even though they could produce. It's just that they couldn't keep accumulating inventory. And so they were able to recover some of that production once they were able to sell. Rosneft is now currently marketing about 2/3 of Venezuelan exports, and one of the biggest question marks for this year is the following. Their debt is almost totally paid. Maybe it's already paid or it's going to be paid in February. So the question is, what is the U.S. going to do once Rosneft is not paying debt, but it's basically either sending back the cash or CNPC, the Chinese national company, stopped buying oil. But we know that, and if you go to the official figures of China, they say they are importing no barrels of oil from Venezuela. But we do know on estimates that it's still the largest buyer of oil from Venezuela, but it's done with transshipment in Malaysia and the African coasts to hide the origin of the oil. Rosneft, also doing transshipment, etc., provides some of the diluents to Venezuela at a very steep price. So the combination of big discounts on what you sell plus big premiums on what you buy, it's deadly. They tell me that there are months in which Rosneft, even though it sends a much less diluent than the oil that it gets, the net is zero. So Venezuela, PDVSA doesn't get anything because the price at which they charge the diluent is so much higher than. So it's really a very bad situation. The U.S. has threatened secondary sanctions, but it has been, to me, unclear, when they are going to implement it clearly or not. They seem to have allowed cargoes that are to either the partner of PDVSA to repay their share, including Chevron, for example, and Repsol, notably, and Eni. But on the other hand, and that seems to apply also to Rosneft, but on the other hand, CNPC stopped buying oil. for a while reliance of India stop buying oil. So it's not clear to me exactly how this is working. And by the way, we don't know, we know about the general licenses, but we don't know about the specific licenses. So there might be some specific licenses that have been granted that we don't know about. I already mentioned the thing about Rosneft. So the question now is, basically PDVSA today is giving the partners the oil to see if they can market it. And of course, if that is not generates cash flow for PDVSA, the U.S. government apparently shouldn't care. But it's unclear how this will be enforced, etc. How the Indians will react, and eventually the other question is if the companies will leave. And to finish, the Western companies, because Chevron operates in Venezuela, but also Total, Repsol, Eni, and Equinor. Even though Chevron is the only one who has a license, because the other ones do not need a license to operate, you have to wonder if the sanctions keep increasing. By the way, one potential increase in sanctions could be not allowing insurance company or reinsurance company to insure any tankers that go to Venezuela. There are things that could worsen the situation. So, as I said, one key question is how, after sanctions are lifted, the oil industry will recover. The estimate that some experts working for the Guaidó administration have made is that it will require about $120 billion of capex in about 7 to 10 years to add 2 million barrels of oil. And that's a very significant number. There are others that think that there are a few barrels that are just opening production capacity, and that will be much easier. These are, examples of other countries that had like a big recovery like Iraq, but Venezuela, because of the nature of its fields, should be relatively different. So the bottom line on the oil sector itself is the following, I think. The sanctions, the oil sector was in decline. I have seen, Francisco's work on what would be the counterfactual if there were no sanctions. I think it's hard to know, because default was also, a contributing factor. You had also, in the oil sector, the lag between investments decline and eventually production decline can take a long time. But without a doubt, the sanctions in 2019 had a significant effect. Even if you add, I think it's important, and there have been studies like Jose Ramon Morales has studied the role of the electricity blackouts, which seem to be very, very important also. Of course, it's hard to know if the electricity blackouts are related to sanctions or not too, because, some parts of the equipment or whatever, but there seem to be, other factors, but no doubt that the sanctions are an important piece of the decline. In fact, I think the reduction in production has been bigger than I expected, because I thought that part of the 500,000 barrels that went to the US will be able to be sold in Asia, and because of the reasons of discounts, etc., it hasn't been the case. So I think later we can discuss about how things could be changed moving forward. But the bottom line is now you have a tiny oil industry compared to the one we had in the past, and the recovery of it will require massive amounts of investment.
Okay, thank you very much, Francisco Rodriguez.
Pero ya tiene que ponerte la...
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much for all of you for being here. And I'd like to thank David and the Stone Center and Sleeper for organizing this event and for this opportunity to have a discussion about what, as David said, is a very controversial issue, but where social scientists should be looking at the data, at the evidence, and trying to understand first what it tells us about what's going on, and second, given a diagnosis, what are the policy implications that would have? So I will start out first by looking a bit at the bigger picture and thinking about Venezuela's growth collapse. So per capita income between 2013 and 2019 fell by 3/5, by exactly 59.9%. And that's actually quite puzzling because it is a very large collapse. It is the largest collapse in recorded Latin American economic history since there's comparable data from 1950. It's the largest in Venezuelan history according to historical estimates. It is greater than that which occurred during the Venezuelan civil wars in the 19th century. And it is one of the largest in the world, also since 1950. It ranks at exactly number 13 in a list which is essentially basically post-conflict countries and also countries coming out of the post-Soviet transition. Now, typically, if you look at what the standard explanation, and it's interesting as we were coming here, there was somebody who reacted on this by Twitter saying, but we don't need to discuss that. I mean, we already know that this is just due to kind of the incompetence of Maduro and Chavez. And it is true that if you look at a lot of the writing, say a lot of the journalistic accounts, they basically start out from that assumption, but there is, but they don't cite much scholarly research because there isn't much scholarly research either in favor of that hypothesis or of any other one. But what's interesting is that we know of some cases that have had similar policy frameworks in Latin America that have occasioned growth collapses, but not of this magnitude. So I put up there two examples, which were Peru during the first Alain Garcia administration, and Nicaragua after the Sandinista revolution. And by the way, these were two countries that had armed conflicts, Peru against Shining Path and Nicaragua against the Contras. So you would have expected, if anything, that the contraction would be bigger than one of a country which has not had an armed conflict. But actually, no, they're less than half in the case of Peru and almost exactly half in the case of Nicaragua. So there is an excess contraction here, which is kind of a data anomaly that we have to try to understand. And there's a question of, well, how much of this could be due to sanctions or not, and we definitely do have some very concrete policy interventions that have already been mentioned: financial sanctions, oil sanctions, and a more recent order that I'll go a bit into it. So what I want to try to do is take you through the data very rapidly. This is a comparison of Venezuela's recent contraction with a contraction that was associated with a similar decline in oil prices between 1977 and 85. Again, the type of contraction that you would have expected in Venezuela if you were just told this is the Venezuelan economy and it imposes exchange controls and price controls and has a very powerful state. And then oil prices plummet. You would have expected something on the order of what we saw at the end of the 70s and to the mid 80s, but you ended up seeing something much larger. I'll skip through this. This is some of the comparative data that puts Venezuela along with the Latin America list. Now, I want to first of all stop for a minute and talk about the issue of the counterfactual, which has already come up, in which Francisco Monaldi, I think, made some very good points about it, because as David mentioned, it is very common to hear in the policy discourse assertions of the type the sanctions began way long after the crisis started, so therefore they cannot have caused the crisis. And that reasoning is wrong, among other things, because crises and many social problems can have multiple causes, so there's no reason why you couldn't have had bad policies and sanctions both contributing to the crisis, but also because there's an incompleteness there in specifying what the counterfactual is, what would have happened to the Venezuelan economy from 2017 onwards with in the absence of sanctions. And I think that also, if you try to bring in another explanation like policies, then you also have to build that into the counterfactual. And I think that this is what Francisco was essentially saying. So is the counterfactual what would have happened to the economy without sanctions and with the same policies, or is the counterfactual what would have happened to the economy with different policies? So those are two different questions, and I think part of the confusion here is that different people are trying to answer one of these two questions, but not both at the same time. I would also point out that there is a broader phenomenon here which makes it difficult to identify the effect of sanctions, which is that sanctions are an endogenous variable, and sanctions are essentially part of a political strategy. It's a political strategy to try to get the Maduro government to back down on some of the things that it's done. And that political strategy has one consequence, which is sanctions, but it has other consequences which can also affect the willingness of people to trade with Venezuela. I mentioned there, for example, famous or infamous Goldman Sachs financing of 2017, where they purchased bonds from Venezuela's central bank, and Goldman Sachs ended up in the front cover of the Wall Street Journal for 5 days. So it was a huge scandal, and after that, this happened before the August sanctions, there was essentially no financial institution that had any respectable name that was willing to do business with Venezuela. So there's a broader process there, which I would call financial toxification, which one also has to try to disentangle. So what is it possible to do in terms of looking at the data? So let me walk you through three very important stylized facts about the Venezuelan economy. First of all, this is a very import-dependent economy. There's a very high correlation. So non-oil import growth explains almost 80% of the variation in non-oil real GDP. So if you do anything to this economy that causes an import contraction, it's going to cause an economic contraction. Number two, Venezuelan oil exports have plummeted, but they plummeted for two reasons. One of them, and this is the beginning of the crisis, was because of the decline in oil prices. The second reason was because of the decline in production that made it that did not enable Venezuelan oil exports to recover as they would have had production been constant after oil prices began increasing in 2017. And the third point, and I want to spend some time on this table, is that if we're just focusing on the growth collapse, then imports account for nearly 3/4 of the growth collapse. So this is what we economists call growth accounting exercise, and it is a decomposition of growth in increases in capital stock, and human capital, and productivity. Now, I've augmented this for the role of imports, appealing to some theoretical work that tells us that in economies such as Venezuela's, you should expect to see strong import dependence. And once we do that, what we find is that in the 2013 to 2018 period, the import decline actually accounts for 72% of the contraction. So the main reason why Venezuela contracted between 2013 and today, why it's had this huge contraction that we're talking about, is the decline in imports. Now, that does not mean, and here we go again to the issue of the counterfactual, that doesn't mean that policies were good or that policies weren't doing anything. If we look at total factor productivity growth, in this same period, you have an annual contraction of 3.6%. This is a huge decline in productivity. Most countries have productivity growth of around 2% a year. The countries that do very poorly have productivity growth of around 0%. So to have an annual decline of 4% in productivity, it really means that your ability to convert resources into inputs into outputs is deteriorating, and it's very difficult to come up for an explanation for this that is not something that's traceable to policies. Yes?
Excuse me, what imports do you mean?
So these are these are all the imports in the economy. So basically, what we do is that in the standard growth accounting exercise where you do this decomposition, you don't have imports. However, in a standard economy in which there's perfect substitution across factors, a decline in terms of trade shouldn't really hurt growth, because if your terms of trade decline, then you're just going to be less competitive at, say, producing oil, and you're going to shift resources to produce this is, for example, what happened in Colombia. Colombia had, it was hit by this shock, but its exchange rate appreciated and it started producing a lot of other tradable goods. So the economy didn't contract that much. When you're a fully specialized economy, there's a different relationship. And when you set up the growth model, you can prove that there's a direct relationship between the capital stock and therefore growth of the economy and the level of imports. That's why we augment the growth accounting exercise to take into account imports. What we use for this are imports of the whole economy, yes. So productivity was falling at around 4% a year, which is a pretty big decline. And this, by the way, also allows us to think about the Chavez years in somewhat of a different light, because the Chavez years are years of economic growth. GDP grew by an average rate of GDP of 3.3% a year, which is reasonable. However, what we find is that, and see that not even in this can Maduro beat Chavez, the productivity decline during Chavez was even greater than during Maduro. It was 4.5% a year. Again, these are massive declines. What that means is that if it had not been for the productivity decline, Venezuela had constant productivity. During the Chavez years, Venezuela should have grown at 7.9% per year. However, and I will get there, that definitely tells us that the economy would have been much better off if it had not been for the poor policies of Chavez and Maduro. So if we're trying to specify that counterfactual, then it's definitely the case that the economy has suffered a lot from these policies. If we're trying to talk about the decline between 2012 and 2018 or 19, it's a different story, because the Maduro decline in productivity of 3.6% a year, it basically gives you, over this 7-year period, around 17%. Once you add in a cumulative effect of the capital stock, it's about 22%. So it still doesn't explain what's going on with the economy in this contraction. So let me, and you saw some of this data already. I would have mentioned that there's some work that I've done in a paper that I published last year, where I tried to get at the issue of the counterfactual through data-driven methods. And the good thing about these methods is that they're just designed to tell you what the data indicates you should use as a proxy for the behavior of the economy, for the performance of the economy in the absence of the intervention. And what the synthetic control group does is that it chooses an economy that is a linear combination of other economies that closely replicates not actually the behavior, but the determinants of the behavior of oil production in Venezuela over the period prior to the collapse. And then after that, we see how it evolved in those economies and how that compares with Venezuela. And we effectively see that this method attributes a very significant effect to the financial sanctions in 2017. I also want to point out, and for reasons of time, I won't be able to go into all of this discussion, that there are, I think, a number of there are a number of pieces of evidence that really suggest that the financial sanctions have a significant effect. First of all, let me make the point that the hypothesis here is not that PDVSA or the Venezuelan government would have issued more bonds. It's clear that by the beginning of 2017, its ability to issue unsecured debt was very limited. But that was not the case for joint ventures. So up until mid-2017, there were financing agreements that were being signed with joint ventures, where joint venture partners would lend into the joint venture and would get paid from the production of that joint venture. Those were being signed into 2017. Debt with contractors was also being renegotiated in 2017. Those came to a halt. And what ended up happening there is that production in joint ventures, which was what was increasing and what was offsetting what was happening in the rest of PDVSA, started contracting. Now, if we look at the data within the oil industry, what we find is that the only two joint ventures that escaped that trend were the Chinese and Russian joint ventures. So this is a very strong suggestion that the places that were less sensitive to having kind of financing in international capital markets ban, and that in fact continue to receive financing, did not see the same pattern as the rest of the industry. We also see something like this with subsidiaries. Citgo had a Sanchez exemption, and Citgo actually did relatively well after 2017. Monomeros, which is a Colombian-based subsidiary, did not have Sanchez exemption, and in fact, it did very poorly after the sanctions. Francisco has pointed out to something very important, which is how can we tell that this decline was not caused by the cumulative effects of underinvestment over many years, and definitely after the decline in oil prices? And I would say we can't. I would invite somebody who wants to develop that hypothesis to really kind of try to come up with a specification of non-linearities and lags that would allow the hypothesis to fit the data. But it's not something that is that easy to discard, and it makes a lot of sense. However, I would point to the fact that the decline in oil production that we have seen since late 2017 is completely in a different dimension from anything that oil analysts had expected. So if you look at IPD America, which is a very respected firm, in May 2017, where everything that we know about the underinvestment and all of the problems in the oil industry were well known, they had three scenarios. Their worst case scenario was an 8% annual decline. We've seen a 36% annual decline. So people who had models to take this into account completely missed the magnitude of the decline. So I want to go a bit towards, because for reasons of time, I want to tell you a bit about what the main takeaways here are. And one of them is, if we ask the question of what drove the Venezuelan economic compression since 2013. Now, since 2013, you have 6 years of Maduro, and as I just pointed out, 6 years of productivity growth at minus 3.6% a year doesn't really cut it. It explains 22.3 percentage points of the decline. It doesn't explain the 62%. This is the aggregate number, not the per capita number. That's why it's 61.7% and not 59.9. With respect to, if we put together both my estimates for the effect of financial sanctions and panel data estimates for the effect of oil sanctions, we get an estimate of 32% of decline in GDP that were caused by the production loss attributable to those sanctions. So in other words, roughly half of the decline in GDP would be due, according to these estimates, to a sanctions effect. There are other causes of the import decline, which don't have to do with productivity, which are the decline in oil prices and the decline in oil production that is not attributable to sanctions. That would account for the remaining 7 percentage points of the decline. Now, however, remember that I told you that this is a different question from what would have happened in Venezuela if you had had better economic policies over the course of the past 20 years. If that had been the case, then what is the counterfactual? Well, a reasonable approximation to that counterfactual would have been zero productivity growth. Let's suppose that we had zero productivity growth from 1999 to today. So the bad policies of Chavez and Maduro had been avoided. As I said, productivity growth in the counterfactual might even be higher, but let's just leave it for a conservative estimate at that. Zero productivity growth. So no harm being done by governments to the economy, at least no obvious harm. Well, in that case, we have to effectively build two scenarios. We have to build a scenario with sanctions, or we have to build a scenario without sanctions, but also we have to build a scenario of productivity decline and a scenario with no productivity decline. Where we are in Venezuela right now is, and I guess I don't have a pointer here now. Okay, so where we are right now is the 2300s. That is Venezuela's current level of per capita GDP, and that is among the lowest in Latin America. If we had had no sanctions, according to our estimate, output would be 83% higher. So Venezuela's per capita output would be $4,000. So in that sense, yes, Venezuela is significantly poorer today than it would be in the absence of sanctions. However, if Venezuela had not suffered the productivity decline that it suffered during the Chavez and Maduro years, its GDP would be more than 3 times as high. So in a scenario of sanctions, you would still have a GDP of around $7,000, which would be higher than the average for the region. And in a scenario with no sanctions, this should be a $14,000 GDP per capita economy, which would be actually relatively close to where Chile is right now. So when you look at those numbers, this reconciles you with the idea that sanctions are not the main cause of why Venezuelans are doing worse right now than what they would be doing in the counterfactual. And there's no contradiction between believing this and believing also what was in the prior slide, that if you're just trying to account for the decline in Venezuelan living standards over the past 6 years, then sanctions do account for a very large fraction, indeed approximately half of them.
All right, well, thank you very much to 3 of you, and let's open it up for questions.
There have been a couple of questions that trickled in online.
Okay.
One has to do with the impact or relevance or importance of oil donations to Cuba. The other more or less has to do with what the impact of the sanctions are on ordinary Venezuelans.
Well, on the Cuba side, I didn't speak, and it was Cuba plus other Petrocaribe, programs that were less subsidized but also subsidized. But I speak, Cuba was about around 120,000 barrels, and it's a big number if you add it over the. Of course, it's hard to evaluate because there was some, contraprestaciones. I mean, they were providing services to Venezuela. I think they were not of the same value, but anyways. So that's a relevant number. Recently, by the way, that went down very significantly to about 20,000 barrels. But recently has gone up, but because they are using Cuba to avoid to sanction avoiding. So even cargos that used to go inside Venezuela, those tankers are being used without the transponders on to go to Cuba. And we know that Cuba cannot process all that oil in the refinery, so it's clearly that that they will be selling it elsewhere. So that's sort of the situation today.
Yeah, I would point out that Cuba, as well as a lot of other ways in which the Chavez and Maduro governments were wasting the money, is precisely what I'm trying to capture with my TFP estimates. Yes, there's because this is actually something that comes up a lot in the discussion about Venezuela. If you say sanctions had an effect, then people will say, well, but there are these other things that are harming the economy. And what I want to point out is, yes, it's true that there are those other things that are harming the economy. And in fact, when we look at these final estimates, they tell us that those things that are harming the economy are doing much more harm to the economy than sanctions. But that is not contradictory with the other finding that most of the decline experienced over the past 6 years, or roughly half of the decline, is and the single most important contributing factor, according to these estimates, to this recent decline is the effect of sanctions. With respect to the effect on ordinary Venezuelans, well, again, we've been discussing what you could term the indirect effect, but it's a very large effect, which is the Venezuelan government is able to sell less oil, therefore it has less money for imports, therefore Venezuela imports less, therefore the economy contracts. This has an effect on the living standards of all Venezuelans. And what, again, my estimates point to is a very significant contribution. over and above this effect on oil production, there are other effects on individuals and on firms, and it is much harder, and I haven't tried to value those other effects. But it is definitely, and there's plenty of anecdotal evidence as to ranging from the fact that Venezuelans have a harder time opening bank accounts in the U.S., that Venezuelans cannot travel directly, there are no direct flights to the U.S., and in fact, if you do travel, say, through Panama, then when you get to Panama, you have to kind of check your bags, and you have to take them out, and then you have to check in again for another flight. There are firms that have stopped licensing software in Venezuela, for example, because of concerns about sanctions. This is a phenomenon that Jeff mentioned, which is the phenomenon of overcompliance. I'm not sure that I like the name overcompliance that much, because it suggests that the problem is with the firms, that they're doing more than what they should be doing, whereas the reality is that all of these are rational responses to the firms to a regulatory framework that imposes a significant degree of uncertainty on them as to what the consequences are of doing business with Venezuela. I wanted to actually also point out something about the blackouts, which Francisco mentioned. This was the center of a piece published by Ricardo Hausman and Frank Musi back in April. Now, explaining the initial collapse in Venezuelan oil production as a result of the blackouts, and they had some daily data there that suggests that there was a relationship with the blackouts. However, if you look at that hypothesis over the longer term, in March there were 8.3 days of national blackouts. In April there were 0.8 days, and in all the remaining months except July there have been 0 hours of national blackouts, except for July, in which there were 0.7 days. So clearly, and if you look at the oil production data, oil production declined in March, and it basically stayed low until August with the threat of the secondary sanctions, which then was not followed up on. And if you look at the secondary sanctions that have been imposed, the only secondary sanctions that have been imposed, there have been 10 firms that have been sanctioned through secondary sanctions. One of them is Eurofinance Mosnor Bank, which is jointly owned with Venezuela. It's a Russian-owned bank, and the other 9 are firms that had tankers involved in oil trade with Cuba. 5 of these happened before August of 2017. 5 happened after August of 2017. So there was no change in the pattern. 2019, sorry. There was no change in the pattern of secondary sanctions with the August executive order, because the PDVSA designation already gave the U.S. the ability to impose secondary sanctions for trading with PDVSA, which is what was used for the 3 August. In fact, no secondary sanctions have appealed to the August 2019 executive order. They all appeal to December 2018 executive order that was used to designate PDVSA. So I think that what we saw there was more a threat of secondary sanctions, which was when the day after the approval of that executive order, John Bolton went to a meeting of the Lima Group and said, you have to choose if you're going to do business with, if you want to keep on doing business with the U.S., you can't do business with the Maduro dictatorship. And there are a lot of firms got scared. 1 month later, John Bolton was out, and over time it became clear that the U.S. was not going to change its pattern, or at least up until now it has not changed its pattern in terms of actual imposition of secondary sanctions.
Just on the impact of sanctions on regular Venezuelans, we work with civil society at WOLA, and as I mentioned, there have been a number of NGOs, civil society organizations that have been impacted since August 2017. There have been banking problems. I'll name one because they've already gone public about this and talked about it, given an interview to the Wall Street Journal a couple months ago. SECODAP is the leading children's rights group in Venezuela. They last year had their bank account frozen in the US, which really complicated their operations on the ground, because NGOs are highly reliant on international donors, and international donors operate in the US banking system. So yeah, these have had an impact on the work of civil society organizations in Venezuela, which are this should be seen as a bug in the system and not a feature. But you know, for most of the time since August 2017, you know, the attitude that we've seen from Treasury has been essentially one of dismissal. It's only recently that we've actually seen Treasury pay lip service to the idea of overcompliance being more than the fault of the banks and financial institutions, as Francisco mentioned. I mean, if you talk to financial institutions, they'll say, well, it's not our fault, we just want more clarity. You know, if you can provide us some specific clarity around things like who is the government of Venezuela, can we work with public actors like nurses and doctors and public hospital systems or public universities, you know, then we're quite willing to expose ourselves to risk in these areas. But yeah, for most of the time since 2017, there really was no interest in addressing that. We've seen some shift in the last 6 months, but that's quite recent.
Any questions here? There's another question on Twitter from our friend Luis Carlos Diaz, who asks about the same. What are the impact? We've been talking about the impact on the economy, impact on the humanitarian emergency. What are the impact of these sanctions, in summary, on the regime? You know, these are a policy tool that is basically sort of a nonviolent way of engaging in conflict. The U.S. is trying to change, trying to pressure Maduro to change and open up democratically. What do you think the impact has been? Just focusing really on the financial sanctions. Well, I guess you focus on all the sanctions. What do you think the impact has been on this? And what are the main factors? What are the main sort of causal phenomena that the sanctions regime has produced that has impacted this issue of whether or not there is some sort of democratic change in Venezuela? Each of you can sort of give your view.
Well, I mean, first, I'll start out from the consensus, even though there may be reasons to question it, but there is kind of a consensus that personal sanctions do matter, that they do have an effect. I mean, certainly we know that the regime officials care about personal sanctions, and they directly convey that, for example, in the negotiation, in the Norway negotiations, for example. So so there are people who do believe that those sanctions have been important in bringing the government to the table. Of course, since we haven't seen any outcome of those negotiations, then it's unclear that they've made any contribution, right? And furthermore, there were talks in Venezuela before sanctions, and there were talks in the Dominican Republic, and there were talks after sanctions. It's not clear that there's that much of an effect. However, in terms of, if you really distinguish and you take out personal sanctions, and I've sometimes grappled with the idea of whether we're contributing to public debate by calling what we've been talking about today sanctions, because this is more a financial and oil embargo on Venezuela. So the 2017 sanctions, even though formally they're sanctions, and when you take an economy that its only oil producer by law and by the Constitution is the state-owned oil industry, and you say, I'm going to sanction just one firm, which is PDVSA, and any entity that's majority owned by PDVSA, then that is exactly equivalent to saying you can't buy oil from Venezuela, because there are no private firms in Venezuela that produce oil. So maybe we should be talking about a financial and oil embargo and sanctions, more properly speaking, which are the personal sanctions. Now, I would also point out to the fact that that for me, it's not, even though many people do believe that the personal sanctions have had an effect, it's very hard to come up with examples where you can say, hey, here's something good that has happened that would not have happened without sanctions. And you had Christopher Figuera, who effectively joined the April 30th military rebellion, but on the other hand, you had, and I published a paper a couple of weeks ago looking at the evolution of the parliamentary majority in Venezuela. And there I estimate that the opposition has lost 29 legislators of its original majority of 112. And only only 7 of those have been lost directly as a result of actions of the judiciary. Effectively putting them in jail or putting them in exile or not allowing them to take their seats as they did in the case of Amazonas. So what that means is that you have 22 legislators that the opposition has lost, which have either gone to the side of the government or have gone to this group of dissidents, which is voting with the government, or are neutral parties that do not vote with the government nor with the opposition. Now, these losses occurred precisely at a moment of intensification of personal sanctions. If personal sanctions were going to have the effect that they were intended to have, we should have seen the contrary, right? I mean, what we should have expected is that Chavista legislators afraid of getting sanctioned and having all of these personal consequences, having their bank account frozen, having their wives and offspring and mistresses kicked out of the U.S., that they should have said, okay, no, I want to become a pro-opposition legislator, that the opposition should have gained votes. We have seen the contrary, and we have not only seen the contrary in terms of direction, but in terms of a huge scale. So you're talking about, well, essentially around a sixth of the parliament and around a third of what was the opposition majority that has been lost. That also suggests that these personal sanctions may not be having the effect that they were supposed to have in terms of changing the loyalties of regime insiders.
Just briefly, I mean, on that last point, of course, again, you have a lot of confounding factors, right? So it's and in this case, that some of them were bought with money, some.
But I mean, it's not like Maduro became kind of more corrupt, more willing to pay. And actually, he should have had less money. If he could pay, they say that they were getting paid $700,000. I mean, Maduro 5 years ago, for him.
I just mean.
10, 20, 30 million.
No. But I just mean because you said only 7 were, the judiciary got them, and the other switch sides. Well, the combination of the reasons why they switch sides might be more compelling than sanctions, right? $1 million plus the threat to do very bad things to your family. I'm not saying that about the timeline, but about the difference between those who are annulled. So, I confess that I'm not sure about that. I think this is a very good question, but I think we have a lot of anecdotal, evidence that it seems that individual sanctions do matter for the oligarchs and for some of the military, that they seem to care about it. And I mean, these people have become around the regime extremely wealthy, and now they have a lot of limits in how they can use their wealth. They have to hide their money in places that you would not like to hide your money because it's probably going to be stolen by someone else. And so I think it's it's reasonable to think that this puts pressure in the government. In terms of the economic non-individual sanctions, I do tend to think that without them, the Maduro regime will be less willing to negotiate. I think they themselves are surprised by how well they have been able to survive in the sense of finding alternative sources of resources to keep the small coalition that now sustain the government happy with them. I think they will reasonably be very worried about that, because you have dramatically declined, and even though they have 15% approval rating, it seems to be enough to sustain the sort of the selectorate, the group of people who seem to be key to sustaining inside the government coalition. I think there are other effects that we might not exactly know. For example, the relative power of those with the legal money in Venezuela now has increased instead of decreased, right? Those who are involved in drug trafficking, who are involved in mining, have, because of the rest of the economy, disappearing, these people have become very powerful actors inside Venezuela in relative terms to the rest of the society. So I'm not sure what it does for the sort of balance of power I do think that even within Chavismo, they are sort of surprised of how well they have managed to sort of sustain the key support that they need to stay in power.
Jeff, final comment?
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously not an economist, so I think what you both said is really compelling. I think it seems like you could make a very clear case that the sanctions have exerted pressure on the Maduro government to come to the table, and they certainly got their attention. But I think the question is, can you calibrate the pressure in accordance with your ultimate objectives? I mean, so far, just insisting on Maduro leaving doesn't seem to be achieving their desired results, and just kind of sitting and crossing your hands and saying, look, we're going to do nothing. We're going to keep the current sanctions regime in place until Maduro leaves. You know, the regime has clearly showed an ability to wait it out, to rely on illicit mining and other sources of income. It doesn't seem that path doesn't seem to be leading to any kind of solution. So again, I think there needs to be a discussion about flexibility around sanctions and the fact that it's not all or nothing. You can lift the sanctions in exchange for certain conditions, like freedom for political prisoners or free and fair elections, and then if that doesn't happen, you can also reimpose them. It doesn't have to be black and white, all or nothing. And I think it is strange that, as I mentioned in my presentation, there's been this communication to individuals that have been individually sanctioned, and there's certain flexibility on the terms of sanctions relief available to individuals. You can get access to sanctions relief for documenting corruption, for speaking out against human rights abuses, for recognizing Guaido. So there's all kinds of flexibility around the individual sanctions, but with the sectoral sanctions, it's all or nothing. So I just think it is this bizarre maximalist positioning that ultimately hasn't worked so far, and the literature suggests ultimately probably won't work. So.
Okay, with that, thank you very much. Let's give a hand to our panelists.